The same blood-stained suit he had worn during the hit. The same gold chain that usually signaled death. The same cold eyes that had never shed a tear. Tae-san looked down at the crumpled $5 bill in his palm. It was damp with sweat and slightly torn. Nari reached out, her small, bandaged hand trembling as she closed his fingers over the money. "Please," she whispered. Tae-san's heart, a stone for 20 years, skipped a beat. "You don't know who I am, kid," he said, his voice a low growl. Nari's eyes were cloudy, but certain. "I know you're the man who can bring him back." The words hung in the sterile air. Heavy. Impossible. True. Tae-san had stood before kings and killers, but he had never felt smaller than he did standing before this 3-foot-tall girl. "Why me?" he asked. Nari's bravery finally cracked. A single tear tracked through the dust on her cheek. "Because you look like someone who doesn't let anyone say no to him." The truth came out in a fragile, broken stream. A year of loneliness finally shattering in room 402. "My mommy said Daddy had to go away to keep us safe," Nari said. Her voice was thin like paper, the voice of a child who had grown up too fast. "She told me he was a hero, but then the bad men came to our house. There was a big crash." Tae-san went still. He remembered the accident on the docks a year ago, a tactical strike his partners had called collateral damage. "The police said it was just a mistake," Nari continued. Her laugh was a hollow, tragic sound. "But Mommy didn't wake up. And Daddy never came back from the shipping office." Tae-san nodded slowly. He knew that office. He owned that office. He had been collecting fees from it for 3 years. The constant drip of greed disguised as business. "I started getting the pains right after," Nari whispered. "The doctors say I'm tired. I just want to tell him I'm not mad before I go to sleep." She stopped, catching her breath. Tae-san didn't move. Some sins required a silent witness. "I found his old watch in the wreckage," Nari said, opening her other hand to reveal a smashed silver timepiece. "It has the name of your company on the back." Tae-san stepped out of the hospital's side exit and into the cold, rainy night. The smell of medicine and old floor wax stayed in his nose, but it was quickly replaced by the scent of expensive leather and gasoline. A fleet of black luxury cars waited for him, their engines humming like hungry animals. His bodyguards stood like stone statues, their hands tucked inside their jackets. They didn't ask where he had been or why there was a small, colorful bandage on his hand from where Nari had touched him. They simply opened the door to the lead car. Inside the vehicle, the air was silent and smelled of cedarwood. Tae-san leaned his head back against the soft headrest and closed his eyes. In his pocket, the crumpled $5 bill felt heavier than a brick. It felt wrong to have it there, tucked next to a gold lighter that cost more than a small house. He was the Iron Boss, the man who controlled the docks, the ships, and the very ground the city sat on. He didn't take lunch money from dying children. "The meeting is ready, sir," his assistant, Park, said from the front seat. Park didn't look back. He knew better than to catch the boss's eye when he was in a dark mood. "The investors from the Port Authority are waiting in the penthouse. The contracts are printed. Once you sign, the entire northern coast belongs to the Group. You will be the youngest billionaire in the country's history." Tae-san didn't respond. He watched the city lights blur past the window. This deal was supposed to be his greatest victory. It was the moment he would move from being a criminal to being a king. He had spent 10 years climbing over bodies and breaking bones to reach this table. He had lied, cheated, and stolen to make sure no one could ever look down on him again. The car pulled up to a glass skyscraper that pierced the clouds like a needle. Tae-san walked through the lobby, his polished shoes clicking sharply on the marble floor. Every person he passed lowered their head. They were afraid to even look at his shadow. He liked that fear. Or, at least, he used to. When he reached the top floor, the boardroom was filled with men in gray suits. These were the clean businessmen, the ones who used pens instead of guns, but Tae-san knew they were just as greedy as any street thug. On the giant mahogany table sat a stack of papers. To anyone else, it was just a contract. To Tae-san, it was the final piece of his empire. He sat at the head of the table. A waiter brought him a glass of water, but Tae-san didn't touch it. He looked at the men across from him. They were smiling, their eyes bright with the thought of the millions they would make. They talked about efficiency and growth, but Tae-san knew what those words really meant. They meant taking over the docks where Nari's father used to work. They meant clearing out the rubbish to make room for giant steel cranes. One of the men, a tall executive with a fake smile, pushed a gold pen toward Tae-san. "It's a historic day, Mr. M. With one signature, we change the face of this city forever. No more small-time operations. Just us." Tae-san picked up the pen. It was heavy and cold. He looked down at the signature line, but he didn't see his name. He saw the drawing Nari had given him, the one of a strong man holding a little girl's hand. He thought about the $12 sitting in his pocket. These men in front of him were offering him billions, but for the first time in his life, the money felt like ash. He looked at the executive's expensive watch. It was a silver brand, shiny and perfect. Then, he remembered the smashed watch in Nari's hand, the one with his company's logo on the back. The accident that had ruined her life wasn't just a mistake. It was a line item in a budget. It was a choice made in this very room to save money on safety so they could have more for themselves. The room was silent, waiting for the Iron Boss to claim his prize. Tae-san's hand hovered over the paper. His heart beat slowly, like a heavy drum. He realized that if he signed this, he wasn't just becoming a billionaire. He was becoming the man who had killed Nari's mother. He was the bad man she was so afraid of. He tightened his grip on the pen until his knuckles turned white. The men around the table started to look nervous. They shifted in their seats, wondering why the most ruthless man in Korea was hesitating. Tae-san looked at the gold pen, then at the multi-million-dollar contract. He thought of the quiet, sterile hospital room and the girl who believed he could do anything. "Is there a problem, Mr. M?" the executive asked, his voice shaking slightly. Tae-san finally looked up. His eyes were no longer cold. They were burning with a dark, quiet fire. He didn't sign the paper. Instead, he slowly stood up, the chair screeching against the floor. He reached into his pocket and felt the crumpled $5 bill. It was the only honest money he had ever earned. "The deal is on hold," Tae-san said. His voice was like grinding stones. The boardroom erupted in whispers and gasps. "On hold? Sir, the market opens in an hour. The investors." "I don't care about the investors," Tae-san interrupted. He turned and walked toward the door, leaving the gold pen and the billion-dollar dream behind. As he stepped into the elevator, he looked at his reflection in the mirrored walls. He still looked like a monster in a beautiful suit, but as the doors closed, he knew he had a job to do, and it wasn't for the men in this building. It was for a girl in room 402. The drive back to the hospital was much quieter than the trip to the skyscraper. Tae-san sat in the dark, watching the raindrops race each other down the window. His men were confused. He could see them glancing at him through the rearview mirror. They didn't understand why he had walked away from the biggest deal of his life. To them, he was the Iron Boss, a man who only cared about power. They didn't know about the $12 contract tucked inside his suit jacket. When the car pulled up to the hospital, Tae-san didn't wait for his guards to open the door. He stepped out into the rain and walked straight toward the entrance. His shoulder was throbbing where the assassin's bullet had grazed him earlier that day. He told his men to stay in the lobby. He said he was going up for a simple checkup to make sure his wound was healing. It was a lie, but it was a lie they had to believe. The hospital at night felt different than it did during the day. The hallways were dim, and the only sound was the hum of the vending machines and the soft squeak of nurses' shoes. Tae-san ignored the pain in his shoulder. He wasn't looking for a doctor. His feet moved on their own, leading him toward the elevator and up to the 4th floor. He stood outside room 402 for a long time. Through the small glass window in the door, he could see Nari. She looked even smaller than she had before. The machines next to her bed flickered with green and red lights, making steady beeping sounds that filled the silence. She was awake, staring at the ceiling. She looked like a tiny bird lost in a forest of white blankets. Tae-san pushed the door open slowly. The hinges made a tiny sound, and Nari turned her head. When she saw him, her tired eyes brightened just a little bit. She didn't look at him with fear like the businessmen in the boardroom did. She looked at him with hope. "You came back," she whispered. Her voice was so thin it sounded like a breeze through dry leaves. Tae-san pulled a plastic chair over to the side of her bed. The chair was cheap and uncomfortable, a far cry from the leather throne he sat in at his office. "I had to check on my client," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "A contract is a contract." Nari reached out and touched the sleeve of his expensive suit. "Did you find him? Did you find my daddy?" Tae-san looked down at his hands. He hadn't found him yet, but he knew the search was going to be dangerous. "I'm working on it," he promised. "My people are looking everywhere. But you need to tell me more. The doctors, what do they say about you?" Nari looked away, focusing on a small stuffed bear at the foot of her bed. "They think I'm sleeping when they talk," she said softly. "I heard the lady in the white coat talking to the nurse this morning. She said the medicine isn't working anymore. She said I only have a few weeks left, maybe less." The words hit Tae-san harder than any physical blow ever had. He had seen people die before. That was part of his dark world, but this was different. This wasn't a battle or a fair fight. It was just a little girl running out of time. He felt a surge of anger deep in his chest. He was a billionaire with enough power to move mountains, yet he couldn't stop a clock from ticking. "A few weeks isn't much time," Tae-san muttered, mostly to himself. "It's okay," Nari said, turning back to him. She tried to smile, but it looked painful. "I just want to see him one more time. I want to give him the watch. I want to tell him I love him. If you do that, I can go to sleep and not be scared." Tae-san looked at the machines. The heart rate monitor showed a slow, steady pulse. Every beat was a second he was losing. He realized then that his multi-million-dollar deal didn't matter at all. The port, the ships, the money, they were all ghosts. The only thing that was real was the girl in this bed and the promise he had made. A nurse walked into the room to check the 4-bag. She stopped when she saw Tae-san sitting there. She looked at his sharp suit and the gold chain around his neck, and her eyes went wide with worry. She knew he didn't belong in a place like this. "Sir, visiting hours are over," she said nervously. Tae-san stood up. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of $100 bills, placing them on the bedside table. "Get her whatever she wants," he ordered. "Better food. Softer blankets. Whatever she asks for, she gets. If anyone gives her trouble, they answer to me." The nurse gasped, but she didn't argue. Nobody argued with the Iron Boss when he used that tone of voice. Tae-san turned back to Nari. He reached out and gently patted her hand. His skin was rough and scarred, while hers was soft and pale. "I'm going now," he said. "I have work to do. I won't stop until your father is standing in this room. Do you believe me?" Nari nodded, her eyes filling with tears of relief. "I believe you, Mr. Strongman." Tae-san walked out of the room and closed the door. He stood in the hallway for a second, breathing in the cold air. The Iron Boss was gone. In his place was a man with a mission that had nothing to do with profit. He took out his phone and dialed Park's number. "Forget the port deal," Tae-san said as soon as his assistant picked up. "I want every man we have on the street. I want the files on the dock accident from last year. I want to know exactly where Nari's father is, and I want to know who is hiding him. If anyone gets in your way, break them." He didn't wait for an answer. He headed for the elevator, his mind already racing. He had weeks to do the impossible, and for the first time in his life, he knew exactly what he was fighting for. Tae-san sat in the back of his car, the glow of his laptop screen lighting up his tired face. Outside, the city was a blur of neon lights and shadows. He wasn't looking at bank accounts or shipping schedules anymore. He was looking at a digital ghost. Park sat in the front seat, typing quickly on a tablet. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the sound of fingers hitting keys. "I found the man, sir," Park said, his voice quiet. "His name is Hanjun. He was a supervisor at the docks. He had a reputation for being honest, too honest. A year ago, he filed a report about the safety of the cranes. 2 days later, the accident happened that killed his wife. Then, he simply vanished." Tae-san stared at a blurry photo of Hanjun on the screen. The man had a kind face and eyes that looked just like Nari's. An honest man doesn't just vanish, Tae-san muttered. Not unless someone makes him. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Follow the money, Park. Who benefited from that report disappearing? Who stands to lose the most if Han-jun talks? Park hesitated, his breath catching. That is where it gets complicated, sir. I tracked the private security logs from the night of the accident. The men who took Han-jun weren't random thugs. They were wearing the insignia of the Dragon Syndicate. Tae-san felt a cold chill run down his spine. The Dragon Syndicate was led by Chairman Kong, the very man Tae-san was supposed to sign the port deal with. Kong wasn't just a business partner. He was the rival who would have become Tae-san's brother in the new empire. If Kong was holding the father, it meant the accident wasn't an accident at all. It was a murder. And Tae-san had been about to shake the hand of the man who did it. Where is he? Tae-san asked. His voice was so low it sounded like a growl. They're keeping him in a basement warehouse near the old pier, Park replied. It's a ghost site. No records, no cameras. Kong is keeping him alive because Han-jun has a physical copy of the safety report that could ruin the syndicate. They're trying to scare him into telling them where he hid it. Tae-san looked out the window at the dark water of the harbor. He had spent his whole life trying to be the most powerful man in this city. He had worked with men like Kong because that was how the world worked. You didn't ask questions about collateral damage. You just looked at the profit. But now, he thought of the $12 in his pocket. He thought of Nari, who only had a few weeks to live, waiting in a hospital bed for a father who was being tortured by Tae-san's own associates. He realized that by helping Kong grow powerful, he had helped build the walls of the prison that held Han-jun. He was just as guilty as the men in the boardroom. The realization felt like a lead weight in his stomach. He wasn't just a bystander. He was part of the machine that had crushed Nari's family. Change of plans, Tae-san said, his voice turning into ice. We aren't going back to the office. Call the inner circle. Tell them to meet me at the safe house near the pier. Tell them to bring the heavy gear. Sir, Park said, turning around with a worried look. If you move against Kong now, you lose the port. You lose the billions. You'll be starting a war that will turn the whole city against us. Your own lieutenants might turn on you for throwing away the money. Tae-san reached into his suit jacket and pulled out the crumpled $5 bill. He held it up so Park could see it. This is the only contract that matters now, Tae-san said. The billionaires can keep their money. I'm going to go get that girl her father. The car sped up, weaving through the late-night traffic. Tae-san watched the skyscrapers disappear behind them as they headed toward the gritty, industrial part of the city. He knew that by the time the sun came up, he would be the most hunted man in Korea. He would be walking away from everything he had ever built. But as he looked at the photo of the father on the screen, he didn't feel any regret. He felt like he was finally waking up from a long, cold sleep. The ghost of a father wasn't just Han-jun anymore. It was the man Tae-san used to be, and he was ready to bury that man forever. Tae-san sat at the long marble table once again. The room was filled with the smell of expensive coffee and the sound of nervous breathing. Chairman Kong sat across from him, wearing a wide, greedy smile. Between them lay the final contract. If Tae-san signed it, he would become the richest man in the country. If he signed it, he would also become the partner of the man who had stolen Nari's father and ruined her life. The gold pen felt like a hot coal in his hand. He looked at the signature line, but his mind was back in room 402. He could still feel the way Nari's small hand had trembled when she gave him her $5. On the wall, a large television screen showed the morning news. The volume was low, but the headline caught Tae-san's eye. Local hospital asks for donors for terminal children. Below the text, a brief video clip played. It was only 3 seconds long, but it showed Nari. She was sitting up in her bed, looking pale and tired, clutching the stuffed bear Tae-san had seen the night before. The reporter mentioned that her condition was fading fast. She didn't have much time left. Chairman Kong leaned forward, tapping the paper. Is something wrong, Tae-san? You seem distracted. Just sign the paper, and we can celebrate. The world is ours. Tae-san looked at Kong. He saw the expensive suit and the cold, calculating eyes. He realized that Kong didn't care about the lives he had destroyed to get this deal. To Kong, Nari was just collateral damage. To Taesan, she was the only person who had ever looked at him and seen a hero instead of a monster. Taesan slowly laid the gold pen down on top of the contract. He didn't pick it up again. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled $5 bill Nari had given him. He smoothed it out on the table, right next to the billion-dollar deal. "What is that?" Kong asked, his smile disappearing. "Is this some kind of joke?" "This is a real contract," Taesan said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "This belongs to a girl who has more heart than everyone in this building combined. She paid me to do a job, and I'm going to finish it." Taesan stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He didn't look at the contract again. He didn't look at the shocked faces of the investors. He walked toward the door, his footsteps heavy and firm. "If you walk out that door, you're a dead man," Kong screamed, his face turning red with rage. "I'll take everything you have. I'll destroy you." Taesan paused at the doorway, but didn't turn around. "You can have the money, Kong. I'm going to go be the man she thinks I am." He stepped into the hallway and kept walking. Behind him, he could hear the boardroom erupt into chaos. The deal was in shambles. His empire was falling apart. But as the elevator doors closed, Taesan felt a strange sense of peace. He had made his choice. The war had begun, and he was finally fighting on the right side. The world fell apart the moment Taesan stepped onto the sidewalk. The sun was high, but the air felt cold. He didn't even make it to his car before the first gunshot rang out. The bullet shattered the window of his lead black sedan, sending glass spraying across the pavement like diamonds. His bodyguards jumped into action, pulling their weapons and forming a circle around him. "Get him out of here," Park shouted, his voice cracking with fear. Taesan didn't run. He walked calmly to the second car as bullets hissed through the air, hitting the metal doors with loud thuds. He could see Chairman Kang's men across the street, hiding behind concrete pillars. They weren't hiding their faces anymore. This wasn't a secret disagreement. It was an execution. Taesan's driver slammed the car into gear, tires screeching as they raced away from the skyscraper. "Sir, your phone," Park said, handing him a vibrating device. "It's the bank." Taesan took the call. The voice on the other end was cold and professional. "Mr. M, we have received a court order regarding the Port Authority merger. All your personal and business accounts have been frozen effective immediately. Your credit cards are no longer active." Taesan hung up without saying a word. In 10 minutes, he had gone from a billionaire to a man with nothing but the cash in his pocket and the clothes on his back. Kong was moving faster than he expected. By freezing his money, Kong was making sure Taesan couldn't pay his soldiers. In the Mafia world, loyalty usually ended when the paycheck stopped. "They're hitting the docks, too," Park whispered, looking at a security feed on his tablet. "Our warehouses are being seized. Your lieutenants are calling. They want to know why you threw away the deal. Some of them are already talking to Kong." Taesan looked at the $12 contract he had placed on the dashboard. He was now a hunted man in his own city. Every police officer, every gang member, and every greedy businessman was looking for him. He had no empire, no money, and very few friends left. "Let them take the buildings," Taesan said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "They think they are taking my power, but they're just taking my weight. We don't need a boardroom to finish this. We just need to get to the pier." As the car sped toward the industrial district, Taesan saw a black SUV following them. Then another. He checked his handgun, clicking the safety off. He was no longer the Iron Boss sitting on a throne. He was a predator in the wild, and for the first time in years, he felt truly dangerous. The war on the docks had begun, and he was ready to burn everything down to keep his promise to the girl in room 402. The safe house was a cold, concrete basement near the docks. Water dripped from the ceiling, and the only light came from a single bulb swinging overhead. Taesan sat at a metal table, looking through a thick folder of papers Park had snatched from the main office before the locks were changed. These were the internal files for the port project, the secret history that Chairman Kong had tried to bury under layers of lies. Taesan's eyes moved quickly across the pages. He found the maintenance logs for the night of the accident. He saw the signatures of the inspectors who had been paid to look the other way. But then he found a medical report that made his blood run cold. It wasn't about the father, Han-jun. It was a report from the night Nari and her mother were brought into the emergency room. He looked at the photos attached to the file. He saw Nari, even smaller then, with dark purple bruises on her arms and shoulders. He had assumed her current bruises were just from her illness, from the needles and the failing health. But as he read the doctor's notes, the truth hit him like a physical blow. Nari hadn't just been a witness to the accident. She had been under the crane when it collapsed. The illness she was fighting now wasn't just bad luck. It was a direct result of the internal injuries and the toxic dust she had inhaled when the syndicate's cheap, rusted machinery crushed her home. They knew, Tae-san whispered, his voice trembling with a rage he had never felt before. They knew the equipment was broken. They knew a family lived in the path of the collapse. And they chose to save $10,000 on repairs instead of saving a child's life. Park looked down, unable to meet the boss's eyes. The report says Chairman Kong personally signed the order to ignore the safety warnings, sir. He called the family unnecessary obstacles to the port's progress. Tae-san stood up so quickly that his chair flipped over and crashed against the floor. He thought of Nari's pale face in room 402. He thought of her offering him her tiny life savings to find her father. She was dying because the men he had called partners were too greedy to fix a rusted bolt. Every dollar in Tae-san's frozen bank accounts was stained with the blood of that little girl. He grabbed his jacket and checked his weapon one last time. He didn't care about the frozen assets or the hitmen outside anymore. This wasn't just about a promise anymore. This was about justice. We aren't waiting for them to find us, Tae-san said, his eyes glowing with a dark, deadly light. We're going to the warehouse. We're getting her father out, and I'm going to make sure Kong pays every cent he owes that girl in blood. Tae-san didn't use a silencer this time. He wanted Chairman Kang's men to hear him coming. The warehouse at the old pier was a rusted skeleton of a building, surrounded by tall fences and guards with cold eyes. Tae-san watched from the shadows of a shipping container, his breath visible in the chilly night air. He wasn't there to steal a shipment of gold or a briefcase of cash. He was there for a man who didn't have a penny to his name. Go, Tae-san whispered into his radio. A loud explosion rocked the front gate as one of Tae-san's trucks rammed through the fence. While the guards rushed toward the fire, Tae-san moved like a ghost through the side entrance. He didn't waste bullets. Every shot he fired was precise, taking down the men who stood between him and the basement stairs. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands were steady. He wasn't the Iron Boss tonight. He was a hammer coming down on a crooked nail. He reached the basement door and kicked it open. The room was dim and smelled of damp concrete and fear. In the corner, tied to a wooden chair, was a man who looked like a shadow of the photo Tae-san had seen. Han-jun's face was bruised, and his spirit seemed crushed. He looked up, squinting at the bright light of Tae-san's flashlight. "Are you here to kill me?" Han-jun asked, his voice cracking. Tae-san didn't answer. He walked over and sliced the ropes with a quick flick of his knife. "I'm here because your daughter hired me," Tae-san said. He reached into his pocket and showed Han-jun the crumpled $5 bill. "She paid me to bring you home. We're leaving. Now." Han-jun tried to stand, but his legs gave out. Tae-san caught him before he hit the floor. The Mafia boss, a man who usually wouldn't let anyone touch his expensive suit, threw the broken man's arm over his shoulder. He could hear more sirens and the shouting of Kang's reinforcements outside. They were surrounded. "You should leave me," Han-jun gasped. "They want the report. They'll kill you to get it." Tae-san gripped the man's jacket tighter. "I've spent my whole life taking things that didn't belong to me," he said, pulling Han-jun toward the exit. "Tonight, I'm giving something back. Keep your head down and keep moving. We have a little girl waiting for us." They burst out of the basement and into a storm of gunfire. Tae-san used his tactical skills to lead them through the maze of crates, returning fire with one hand while holding Han-jun up with the other. He didn't care about the billions he had lost. He only cared about the man shivering at his side. They reached the getaway car just as the warehouse began to swarm with enemies. As the tires screamed against the pavement, Tae-san looked back at the pier. The rescue was a success, but the hardest part was still ahead. The hospital looked like a quiet island in a dark ocean as Tae-san pulled the car into the emergency bay. Han-jun was shivering in the passenger seat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Tae-san didn't look back to see the black SUVs following them. He knew they were there. He could feel the eyes of the Dragon Syndicate on his neck like a cold blade. He grabbed Han-jun's arm and pulled him toward the sliding glass doors. "Go to room 402, Tae-san commanded, pushing the father toward the elevators. "Don't look back. Don't stop for anyone. Just get to your daughter." Han-jun hesitated, looking at the blood on Tae-san's sleeve. "What about you?" "I'm settling the bill," Tae-san said, his voice as hard as iron. As the elevator doors closed, the clean world of the hospital, the white tiles, the smell of soap, and the soft humming of life-saving machines, felt fragile. Tae-san stood alone in the lobby, a dark shadow in a bright place. He turned to face the entrance, just as 3 SUVs screeched to a halt outside. Men in black suits stepped out, their silenced weapons gleaming under the streetlights. They were the ghosts of Tae-san's past, and they were here to finish the job. Tae-san stepped into the stairwell, blocking the path to the upper floors. He wasn't fighting for a port or a pile of money anymore. He was the only thing standing between the dirty world of the Mafia and the innocent world of a dying girl. When the first hitman kicked the door open, Tae-san didn't hesitate. He moved with a speed that came from years of survival. He used the narrow walls to his advantage, taking down the attackers one by one. Bullets chipped the white paint of the walls, sending plaster flying like snow. Tae-san felt a sharp pain in his side as a shot grazed his ribs, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't let them reach the 4th floor. He couldn't let Nari's final moments be filled with the sound of gunfire. He fought with a desperate strength, using every trick he knew to keep the hallway clear. By the time the last attacker retreated, the stairwell was silent. Tae-san leaned against the wall, his breath heavy and his suit ruined. He looked at his hands. They were covered in dust and blood. He was a monster, but tonight, he was a monster protecting a miracle. He looked up at the ceiling, thinking of the room 3 floors above. The siege was over, and the path was clear. The hospital hallway was finally quiet. The only sound was the distant hum of a cleaning machine and the soft thump-thump of Tae-san's heart. He stood in the shadows just outside room 402, his back against the cold wall. He stayed out of the light because he didn't want the dirty world of his life to touch the clean world inside that room. He looked through the small glass window, his breath fogging the pain. Inside, the miracle was happening. Han-jun was kneeling by Nari's bed, holding her tiny, pale hand in both of his. The father was crying, his shoulders shaking as he whispered words of love and apology. Nari wasn't looking at the machines or the ceiling anymore. Her eyes were fixed on her father's face. She looked peaceful, like a person who had been holding a heavy weight and was finally allowed to put it down. Tae-san watched as Nari reached out with her free hand. She touched her father's cheek, wiping away a tear with her thumb. She looked stronger in that moment than any of the Mafia bosses Tae-san had ever known. She had fought to stay alive just long enough to see this reunion, and she had won. Her wish was no longer a dream. It was real. "I knew he would bring you," Nari whispered. Her voice was so quiet it was almost a ghost, but it reached Tae-san's ears through the door. "The strong man," he promised. Han-jun nodded, kissing his daughter's forehead. He didn't know that the man who saved him was bleeding behind a wall just a few feet away. He didn't know about the millions of dollars lost or the war that had been fought in the stairwell. All he knew was that his daughter was smiling. Tae-san felt a strange warmth in his chest. It was a feeling he hadn't had since he was a little boy, before he became the Iron Boss. It was the feeling of doing something right, not because it made him rich, but because it was the truth. He looked at the $12 contract he had been carrying. It was no longer just money. It was proof that he could be more than a monster. Slowly, the beeping of the heart monitor began to change. The rhythm slowed down, becoming a long, steady hum. Nari's eyes stayed on her father as they gently closed. There was no pain on her face, only a quiet, deep rest. She had seen her father. She had given him the watch. She had finished her story. Tae-san waited until the doctors and nurses rushed in to help the grieving father. He didn't want to be thanked, and he didn't want to explain his presence. While the room was filled with the soft sounds of goodbye, Tae-san slipped inside for just a second. He moved like a shadow, unnoticed by the busy staff. He reached the bedside table and looked at the small stuffed bear and the medical charts. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled $5 bill, the first payment Nari had given him. He smoothed it out one last time and placed it gently on the table next to her hand. It was her receipt for a job completed. The contract was fulfilled. Tae-san walked out of the hospital and into the cool morning air. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. He had no money, no empire, and his enemies were still out there. But as he walked away from the hospital, he didn't look back. He felt lighter than he had in 20 years. He wasn't a billionaire, and he wasn't a boss. He was just a man who had kept a promise to a girl. The $12 he had earned was worth more than all the gold in the world.